Welcome and thank you for standing by. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. All participants are in listening mode only until the question and answer session at the end of today's presentation. To ask a question at that time, you may press star 1 and clearly record your name for a question introduction. Now I'd like to turn the call over to Arlene Dowell. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you, Osmar, and thank you to Deborah Rivera-Nieves from the U.S. Census Bureau for hosting our webinar today. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and a partnership with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, welcome to our July LED webinar. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Kristin McCue as she presents What Causes Labor Turnover to Vary. Hiring occurs primarily to fill vacant slots that occur when workers separate. Equivalently, separations occur to move workers to better alternatives. A model of efficient separations yields several specific predictions. More generally, hires and separations are positively correlated over time as well as across industry and firm. These predictions are borne out in the Longitudinal Employer-Household Dynamics microdata at the economy and firm level. Kristin McCue is a principal economist for the Business Dynamics Statistics Program at the U.S. Census Bureau's Center for Economic Studies, where she co-leads a team working to expand the content of the BDS. She is also collaborating with researchers at Michigan to develop new data resources for studying retirement. Her research focuses on understanding how employer characteristics influence demographic differences in career and earning paths. She received her PhD in economics from the University of Chicago and her MS in survey methodology from the University of Maryland. With that, I hand it over to Kristin.
Thank you, Arlene, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for attending today's webinar. So the first slide just lists sort of the agenda for the talk. There is a longer paper associated with the work. I'm just going to describe a little bit of what we worked on, but if people have questions about the paper, they could send them to me afterwards. There's a link to it at the end of the slide. So the first topic that I'm going to talk about is how you measure turnover using the LED data. One other thing, sort of a housekeeping matter I should mention is that I think I've been a little bit inconsistent in how I term the names that I use for the data. So the LED is Local Employment Dynamics, which is a program at the Census Bureau that puts out a lot of statistics on local employment. There's an underlying database called the Longitudinal Household Income Dynamics database. I've gotten that a little bit wrong. That is the microdata. And so some of the things that I'm going to present involve using the public statistics that come out of the LED program, and some of it is based on calculations from the underlying microdata, and I will try to make it clear which one I'm talking about when we get there. So I'm going to talk in general about how you measure turnover in the LED data, and then I'm going to talk about measuring churn, which requires using the microdata. And then I'm going to present some evidence on differences in turnover rates by industry, and then how it changes over the business cycle.
Kristin, this is Deb.
Yes.
Is your cursor over? Oh, there you go.
Okay.
We can see it. Thank you.
Okay. So this slide gives a little illustration of sort of how the data are put together from the individual information on firms and people. So the statistics I'm talking about from the quarterly workforce indicators are all things that are under this rubric of employment change individual. So they're based on looking at when individuals are changing jobs and tabulating statistics from that. So if you look at the column that has a T up at the top and it's green all the way down, that represents the time period that we're doing the measurement in. And so if you look at the first row, hires all, the X in the yellow box indicates that we count a person as being a hire if they don't have any earnings in that box, so the quarter before T, and that they are employed in T. And so the LED statistics are constructed by counting up the individuals who show up as hires in a particular year. And when I'm presenting, we're mostly going to look at turnover rates. And so to convert them from a count of people to a rate, we're just going to divide through by average employment for the firm that they're at. And in the QWI statistics, it's more generally in sort of the cell that they're at. So it might be, if you're looking at QWI statistics, that you've got the ratio of hires to the number of people who are employed by firms in a particular area or in a particular size class or something like that. So there are a number of different statistics that are put out as part of the QWI statistics that are related to turnover measures. So there are a number of different ways to measure hires and separations, and most of what I'm going to present use kind of a very general, mostly the hires all version, but in some things I've also got some things with we're looking at a narrower set of people who are in a job for at least a quarter. Okay, and I'll try to make the distinction clear when we look at the numbers. Okay, so here are some average hiring and separation rates. And the last column is labeled churn, and I will give that definition in a few minutes. The hires and separations, I think, are a little bit more obvious. So the all job sample is anybody who's shows up with some earnings in a particular quarter is going to get counted as a hire if they are not employed at that same firm in the previous quarter. So the first row hires says the mean is 0.238. So you can kind of convert that to a percentage by just moving the decimal point. So that would be about 24% of employees being new hires at a point in time, which is a very large number, I think, relative to most people's guess at what it would be. If you look over to the third column, where it says mean and it says full quarter jobs, that's if we restrict ourselves to employees who stay for at least a full quarter. So one thing that shows up in statistics from the LED data is that there are a lot of very short-term jobs that if you go to something like the current population survey or the SIP, which also collects information on how long people stay on their jobs, people have a tendency to not report really short-term jobs, and so you get a lot more of them in the administrative records-based measures that are in the QWI than you do in household surveys. So you can see when you look at the full quarter jobs, it's more like 10% of people are moving or are new hires in a particular year, which is also a pretty large number, but not nearly as large as for the sort of all jobs version. There are also standard deviations in this table, and you'll notice that they are substantially larger than the means, because what that means is that there's sort of a lot of variation across both industries and firms, and if you look at age groups or by gender, that there are a lot of differences across the populations that you look at. So there's a lot of variation in turnover rates. I will say that the statistics that I'm presenting are based on 29 states rather than the 51 that exist in the U.S. So the reason for that is that we want to look at changes over time, and in doing that, we want to keep sort of a comparable set of states over time. And some of the states that contribute data to the LED program have data that goes back all the way to 1990, whereas others joined much more recently and only have a few years of data towards the end of the time series. So what we've got here is sort of the 29 states that have a relatively long history of hires and separations, and those include a lot of fairly large states, so California, Illinois, Texas. A lot of those joined pretty early. So it's not entirely representative of the U.S., but in various studies that people have done with the LHD data, generally the finding seems to be that if you're looking at trends, they tend to be, and you've got a reasonably large number of states, the trends you find are not terribly sensitive to which states you get. If you took a lot of small states, that might be less true, but if you start with a bunch of big states, that's not so much of a problem. Okay, so here's a plot with turnover rates by industry. And basically what it has on the y-axis is the separation rate, and on the x-axis it has the hire rate. The red line is the 45-degree line, and the point of including it is basically to make it clear that the industries that have higher rates also have quite high separation rates. So while if you think across firms, there may be firms that are expanding and others that are contracting, it tends to be that most firms are, in fact, doing both at the same time, and that most industries are doing both at the same time as well. And that's one of the reasons that we're interested in this churn measure, which I'll talk about in just a minute. One thing that, let's see, go to the next page. Okay. This is a similar plot, but we've added some data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I want to give a little bit of a plug for this data, even though Census doesn't collect it, because it's a smaller survey, so it doesn't produce as much information at sort of detailed geographic level, for example. But because it's based on going and asking employers about their hiring and the number of employees that they're sort of losing in a period of time, it can also ask about vacancies. And so the BLS actually has some interesting data on vacancies that if you're interested in this topic, you might also want to look at. That's the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. Our main reason for using it here was we wanted to check to see whether the patterns that we see in the LHD data also show up in this other set of data that collects the data in a very different way, but is looking for the same kinds of measures. And you can see that they don't line up exactly, and it tends to be that the JOLTS has slightly lower levels of turnover, but still, if you look at sort of which industries are at the bottom and which are at the top, that's quite consistent. And I think they're generally pretty consistent with what people would expect based on, we know sort of retail has a lot of turnover, and things like manufacturing tend to have low turnover. One thing I would say is there's a category, professional business services, that has very high turnover, and that's, I think, largely because one of the business services that is in that category is temporary services, and so that's one of the reasons why it shows up as having high turnover when there are other things in professional services, like doctors' offices don't have particularly high turnover, and they would fall into that category. Okay, so let me talk about how we measure churn. So the idea of churn is that when we see businesses losing employees or laying them off and hiring other employees, some of that activity is to accommodate either expansion of the business, they're doing well and they need to hire more employees, or contraction if they're need to downsize because they're not doing well. But typically employers are both hiring and having people leave at the same time. And so you can think in a particular period of time, if an employer hires some people and fires others, that some of that is to accommodate changes in the size of the business, but there's additional turnover that is what we're going to call churn. And so it's defined as being the difference between hires and separations, so either hires or separations, and what's needed to accommodate the firm's increase, and sort of the extra is what we're going to count as churn. So as an example, if in a particular quarter, that's how we're measuring it in LHD, because that's sort of the time frame that it has the best measures for. We're going to count, suppose they hire 5 people, but at the same time 2 people leave. So employment increases by 3, so that's sort of, we're going to count that as being new hires that go to accommodate the new size of the employer, but then there are 2 extra people who leave, and we're going to count that as churn. And so this is something that you really have to have the firm level data to calculate the numbers. And currently, while the data that goes into the QWI certainly has the information needed to do that, it's not something that we put out as public statistics. I think partly because it's not as standard a measure as things like hiring rates and separation rates. So we're using basically the same set of states, though. So the numbers we're going to have here are going to be very comparable to the numbers we have from the QWI statistics. Okay. So another thing that is kind of striking about churn rates is that employers differ greatly, even within an industry, in how much churn they have. You can find, so this is a density plot of what the churn rate looks like, and it's weighted by employment. So it's if you look at sort of the peak of the graph, which is say about 0.03 or about 3%, sort of for a large chunk of the population, or large chunk of workers, they're working for firms that have pretty low churn rates. But there's also some extreme at the other end. And so we also see, a non-negligible share of employers that are, turning over 20% of their workers on a quarterly basis. They're unusual, but they're they still account for a significant piece of employment. Okay. So one of the most interesting things about hires and separations and churn is that over the business cycle, you see these kind of distinct patterns. So there are kind of 2 things I want to point out in the graph over the business cycle. So one is that if you look, the higher lines are from LHD, and the others are from JOLT. And I'm going to focus on the LHD ones. But you see there's a downward kind of stair-step pattern over time. So the shaded bars are the years or the quarters that are part of the official recession. So there's a downturn 2001, which is sort of the tech bubble burst. And then there's the much bigger, more severe contraction in about 2007 and 2008. So you can see that the lines are sort of going down somewhat over time, but you see there's there's a big drop in the recession, particularly in the second one. It was a much more severe recession. And then there's some catch up, but the mean sort of over time has gone down and doesn't catch up all the way in either of these recessions. So you can see that both hires and separations go down significantly in recession. And that's quite consistent with the idea that both the hiring and firing or letting go, it's not necessarily firing, sometimes it's people leaving, are positively correlated. So we see them fall together. In the next, so in the next picture, I add churn to the puzzle, or to the picture. And you can see that a big part of that drop is actually this drop in churn. And so in the recession, we see sort of a much less churn, as well as less hiring and separations to accommodate firm growth or firm decline. So those were the things that I wanted to show you, and I think we are about ready for the question and answer period now.
Okay, thank you. At this time, we will begin today's question and answer session of the conference. To ask a question at this time, please press star, then 1, and record your name clearly for a question introduction. Just to let you know, your name must be recorded for the question to be introduced. To retract the question, press star 2. Again, to ask a question, please press star 1 and clearly record your name. And once we have the questions in the queue, we will introduce them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Osmar. And as we wait for participants to queue up for questions, I would like to take a moment just to ask of those who would like to ask a question to please only ask those that pertain to the topic of today's webinar. We would really appreciate that, just so we can allow everybody enough time and to ask whatever questions they might have. I also want to mention that at the end of today's webinar, as you are all exiting the WebEx screen or the WebEx event, you are going to see a pop-up on your screen, and that is an evaluation form, an evaluation survey. We would really appreciate it if you could take a couple of minutes of your time. It doesn't take too long. It's not too many questions, but we certainly appreciate any feedback you can provide, and perhaps you can even suggest topics that you would like to see covered in the future. So thank you. Osmar, do we have any questions in the queue?
Yes, our first question is from Jim. Jim, your line is now open.
Hi. Do you see significant differences in churn across metro areas, even within the same industry?
We have not looked very much at geographic variation, though I would be pretty surprised if there, given how much it varies across employers and industry, that it would be pretty different across areas. It's certainly, it's quite possible to measure them at the metro area. That just sort of wasn't the focus of what we were working on.
Great, thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Anna Maria. Anna, your line is now open.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you had any way to find out the cost of churn, so the cost of hiring a wrong employee and rehiring by particular companies, or just overall.
So I don't know that there's anything in these data that give you a good measure of the cost, except, so there's one cost, which is for employers if they need to hire new people, obviously, that requires staff time. On the worker side, if they're getting laid off, that obviously is likely to have some cost to them in terms of, they lose work time and they don't get paid for that. That you could kind of approximate with how much they're earning when they are employed, prior to being laid off. It would sort of tell you approximately how much their time was worth kind of to their employer, and then that would give you sort of a sense of how much they're losing by taking time off. It's not a calculation that we've done, but I think the QWI would probably give you a way to get an approximation for that, but that probably doesn't help very much on the employer side of the cost.
Yeah, I know there's several articles out there that says that 2003, the U.S. Census Bureau released data on the cost to employers for hiring the wrong employee, training costs and things like that. And so far I have not been able to find that article, so I was hoping maybe somebody here might be able to point me in the right direction.
So the one census survey that occurs to me, I don't actually know a lot about the detailed questions, but it seems like it might be in that vein, would be there's a supplement to the annual survey of manufacturers that is called the Management Organization and Practices Survey, which is, its acronym is MOPS, so that might be an easier way to remember it. And that asks a lot of questions about sort of the details of how manufacturers go about sort of organizing their labor force and making decisions about it. And that might, I would guess if there's a census survey that has that kind of information in it, that would be where I would look for it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
We currently have no questions in the queue, and as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please press *1 and clearly record your name for the question introduction. Okay, we do have a question from Tom. Tom, your line is now open.
Thanks. I was just curious why the turnover indicator in the that you can find on the public QWI data, why you didn't use that at all. The variable called turnover. If you prefer to use kind of your own combinations of hires and separations, or
so there are a couple of reasons. So one is I will admit that this paper we started kind of a while ago, and I think it was before the turnover measure was available. So I saw that when I started putting my slides together, but I hadn't actually seen it before. The other reason that if I were going to redo it, I might still use it, is that we wanted to compare things to the BLS survey.
Okay.
And in doing so, one of the things you kind of need to do is you need to do seasonal adjustment, because otherwise the patterns are sort of, the quarterly patterns are very distinct, and they kind of make it hard to identify other patterns. And so we wanted to use the same same seasonal adjustment for both series. And so we did do some of this sort of redoing things that the QWI does, not because we thought there was anything wrong with it, but because we wanted to be able to do the same thing on the two sets of data.
Okay, so that means you wouldn't have any issue with that variable. It's just based on what the project you were doing. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, there are currently no other questions in the queue. And if you'd like to ask a question, please press *1. Okay, we just have a question arrive in the queue from William. William, your line is now open.
Regarding the charts that were longitudinal, has there ever been a breakdown regarding separations between firings and just leavings?
So in the LED data, because it's derived from sort of the records that come from the unemployment insurance system, there's no kind of asking about, there are other surveys where they ask people whether they, left on their own volition, or whether they were fired. We don't really have a way of distinguishing between whether people are sort of fired versus decided to go on their own. People sometimes use it as like an indicator of that's probably a voluntary separation if people go very directly from one employer to the next one. So in the QWI, in the underlying data for the QWI, that would be people who they're working in one quarter, and the next quarter they're working for a different employer. Some of those people probably, some of those people may have been laid off and just gotten a job right away. But for people who get a job right away, often that's because they've lined up the second job before they left the first one. So.
Thank you.
And again, if you'd like to ask a question, please press *1 and record your name.
So Osmar, this is Deborah Vera. Do we have any questions coming in?
Okay, we do have a question from Latoya. Latoya, your line is now open.
Hi, how are you? I would like to know if your institution is hiring, and if you are, what is the procedure?
Eileen, do you have a?
So this is, I'm sorry, if we could just keep the questions pertaining to the presentation today.
I'm sorry. Hello?
Hi. So if you could probably, wherever you applied, you could probably check that website regarding your application. We don't have those answers here, unfortunately.
Understood. Thank you so much.
We did have previous questions in the queue. However, their name was not recorded. If you ask the question, I will open your line. If you have a question, your line will not be open.
Hello.
Hi, whoever queued up for a question, your name was not recorded, but your line is not open.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, Eileen, thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question is, in the chart that compared hires rates and separations rates from the LED program to those from the JOLTS program, you might have explained this, but why is there such a difference between the two? Why are the JOLTS comparable figures that much lower than the LEDs?
It's hard to say definitively, but we know from other comparisons across surveys that it's not unusual for, so the LED statistics are compiled from the records that the unemployment insurance services in the states keep to track eligibility for unemployment insurance and payroll taxes for unemployment insurance. And so it's, it's a database that's generated by government programs and has a lot of details that are just administrative records and aren't based on questions. They're sort of based on, these records that we get. In surveys, when you ask people questions, often, for individuals, if they don't have a paper record of sort of what happened over time, they have a tendency to forget about things that happened a while ago and to underreport things that they're asked about. So if you ask people how many jobs they had over the last, few months, they might say one when really they had two, or they don't quite remember exactly when things start and stop, and so the reference period it confuses them a little bit. And so for the JOLTS, it's a survey that goes to employers and asks them how many people did you hire in this month.
Right.
There's certainly those employers generally have those records, but when they're getting the survey form, they may not. They've got other things to do too, and they may not go and look at the records and may sort of just guess. And
they may not look back as well as intently or as far back as something like the LED program, which is simply looking at all available information.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you very much.
Oh, sure.
Okay, we do have a question from Patrick. Patrick, your line is now open.
Yes, I was wondering how you handle seasonal layoffs in the wage records. There's a lot of construction employees who just never show up in the first quarter.
So we kind of take them as given. So it will be the case that some of the differences across industries may be differences in the seasonality, or in if record keeping is sort of done in different time frames, that could shift things a little bit too.
Because I noticed the long-term hire thing goes back several quarters, so that kind of eliminates that. But for this study, it was just a short-term hire, right?
Yeah, so we sort of included all hires, which will include some very short-term and some much longer-term.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
There are no other questions in the queue. If you would like to ask a question, please press star 1 and record your name.
Okay, so while we wait to see if there are any other questions in the queue, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Arlene Dowell for organizing this webinar and Kristin McCue for giving this wonderful presentation that has been so informative. As a reminder, you will see that evaluation survey link pop up on your screen once you exit the WebEx session. Please take a moment to tell us how we did today, any feedback you can provide, and also any other topics that you'd like to see covered in a future instance. And as a reminder, we will be putting the recording of this presentation in the Census Academy website under recorded webinars. and that should be available probably within a week or so. We will also make sure to attach the copy of the PowerPoint slide deck as well as the transcript for anyone who might be interested in reading the transcript for that. So we'll do one last check for questions, but otherwise I will turn it back to Arlene to close us out for today.
Hi, Deborah. There are currently no other questions in the queue.
Okay.
If you would like to ask a question, again, as a reminder, press star 1.
Okay, thank you for that. And Arlene, did you want to share any final words with us before we close out for today?
Yes, thank you. Thanks to Osmar and Deborah. Also, I would like to thank Kristin for her excellent presentation. And thank you to our audience for joining us today and such great sophisticated questions that were asked. I wanted to tell you a couple updates that are occurring in the future and coming up. So next month, please join us when Kristin Sandusky presents What May Be Driving Growth in the Gig Economy. It was a featured article that was in our Census America Counts. And then also, registration is now open for the 2019 LED Partnership Annual Workshop set for September 4th through the 5th. You can go to lehd.ces.census.gov to register. So thank you to everyone, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.
Okay, that will conclude today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time. Speakers, please allow a moment of silence and for your pre-conference.